So welcome to those of you who are joining us. Got just a couple of minutes to go before we get started. We're going to give a little bit more time to make sure everyone has a chance to get logged in and settled before we get our webinar underway. Okay, I think we are ready to get going. I want to first say thank you to all of you who are joining us for today's webinar, Shorebirds and Sangria. My name is Paula Noel, and I am the Program Director for New Brunswick with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I will be the moderator today. I would like to start by saying that we at the Nature Conservancy of Canada want to respectfully acknowledge the work that we do across the country is on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. In particular, we recognize that the Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve that we will virtually visit today is located on Mi'kmaq territory of the Fort Folly First Nation. For millennia, they have worked to protect these lands and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. The Nature Conservancy of Canada is a national charity and Canada's leading not-for-profit private land conservation organization, working to protect our most important natural areas and the species they sustain. Since 1962, NCC and partners have helped to protect 14 million hectares or 35 million acres of land, coast to coast to coast. You can learn more about our organization and our work by visiting our website at natureconservancy.ca. For our webinar today, we are joined by Dr. Diana Hamilton, who is the head of the Department of Biology at Mount Allison University, and Jasmine Anderson, who is a shorebird interpreter and manager of our Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve. I'd like to thank our speakers for being with us today to talk about the globally important annual shorebird migration at the Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve on the Bay of Fundy, and how NCC and our partner organizations are working to protect these species. Just before we begin, I just want to cover a few housekeeping points. We are being joined by people from across the country, so you may experience a temporary glitch during the live stream as people join. Thanks in advance for your patience with any technical difficulties we may have. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing a link to the recording after the event. So keep an eye on your inboxes, and we welcome you to revisit the content and share it with colleagues, friends, and family. We want you to join in on the conversation and share your thoughts with our online community. Feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using hashtag NCC Nature Talks during and after the webinar. And we also invite your comments and questions today. You will notice that there is a Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speakers at any point, just type it in there and include who the question is intended for, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. So at this time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Diana Hamilton with Mount Allison University. Dr. Hamilton is a field ecologist with interest in interactions between birds and intertidal communities. She studied shorebirds, in particular semipalmated sandpipers at Johnson's Mills for many years and has worked closely with NCC staff on issues related to shorebird conservation. And I'm handing it over to you, Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Paula. Hi, everyone. as Paula mentioned, my name is Diana Hamilton, and I feel really fortunate to be able to join you today. I was delighted when NCC invited me to speak here because I've had the privilege of working with semipalmated sandpipers at Johnson's Mills for the better part of 2 decades. So today I'm going to spend just a few minutes to tell you some of the things that we've learned over the years. So first of all, we're talking about semipalmated sandpipers. These are these lovely charismatic little birds. They migrate for a great distance from the Arctic all the way down to their South American wintering grounds. And so they're doing this, as you can imagine, it's an incredible exertion. People have compared it to something like a 4-minute mile for 90 hours nonstop in runners' terms. Anyway, so the thing that we're interested in, particularly with these birds, is like many shorebirds in the world, they're suffering global population declines. And then on this stopover location that we see here, right between the Arctic and South America. So they fly, they stop for one important feeding spot, and then they head forward onto their wintering grounds. So obviously this is a tremendously energetically costly event. They need high quality stopover sites to refuel to be able to complete their journey. In fact, without a high quality stopover site, most birds don't make it. And this is, of course, where the Bay of Fundy comes in. So for any of you who aren't necessarily familiar with the geography of Atlantic Canada, the Bay of Fundy is this large area of water that kind of splits New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And the upper bay is divided into 2 arms, what we call Chignecto Bay and Minas Basin. Within Chignecto Bay, we have a region here called Shepparton Bay, and this little arrow points more or less to where Johnson's Mills is. Because of the tidal fluctuations that we see in the Bay of Fundy, we get extensive mud flats that can extend up to kilometers from shore at low tide. And these may not look very exciting, but when you actually walk out into the mud flat, you would find that there's a diverse and interesting community living under the sediment and on the sediment. And this is why the birds are here. They're here to feed, and some of their main prey in the area are what we call mud shrimp. The scientific name is Chirophium volutator, and you can see them here. They're a particularly valuable prey because they're rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are super important for birds in terms of preparation for migration. They also feed on a variety of polychaete worms like the ones you see here, and also, interestingly, on biofilms. Now, biofilms are kind of a film on the surface of the sediment that consists of unicellular algae or single-celled algae called diatoms, as well as bacteria. And these are also really nutritious in terms of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So they provide food for both the birds directly and also into their other prey. Of course, their goal is to gain weight rapidly here. This is the ultimate all-you-can-eat buffet. So essentially, they arrive weighing around 20 grams, leaving around 40 grams. And they do that in a relatively short period of time. But what I want to talk a little bit about today is how things have changed for shorebirds in the Bay of Fundy in the past few decades. So the first and most obvious change that many of you who are familiar with this area might realize is that there are many fewer sandpipers coming through the area than there used to be. In fact, the peak count of shorebirds and maybe the total population estimate is really less than half what it was, say, 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. This figure shows this well. These are data from the Canadian Wildlife Service aerial survey program, where they fly essentially the whole area of the Bay of Fundy and count all the birds that they see. And we've got 4 lines of data here from the 1970s, the 90s, and then 2 more recent ones. And each of these points represents the total number of birds observed on a particular day in the Bay. And what we see is 2 main things. First of all, the peaks are much lower in more recent years. But secondly, the peaks are coming a bit later. And so it looks like the birds are moving through the bay a little later. And in fact, we have good evidence from data collected right at Johnson's Mills by NCC staff and Environment Canada folks that show that this is the case. Because they're present, because the interpreters are present all the time, they're able to do basically bird counts every day. And we took these data from the past, basically from about late 1970s on to currently, and looked at the total numbers of birds that were being counted and looked at the point at which half of the birds that were being counted had appeared. So in other words, are they coming through later or earlier? And this slide essentially shows that in fact they are coming through later, probably about a week later than they did say in around 1980. We've concluded that the warming Arctic may therefore be delaying their migration a little bit, which has implications for mismatches with the prey base and also potential exposure to more storms as the season progresses. So that's something that we're paying attention to. Other challenges that sandpipers are facing, kind of a double-edged sword here, a good news story and a bad news story, is that peregrine falcons have recovered. Now that's a wonderful conservation story, and it's great in all respects except for the fact that it's pretty hard on sandpipers. These falcons harass the sandpipers, they like to eat them. You can see here an image of a falcon chasing this large flock of sandpipers that should be roosting at high tide and instead is flying around. Because of this, site safety is now at least as important for shorebirds as prey availability is. So they may be choosing sites a little bit differently now. And all this movement may slow down weight gain a little bit. The other thing is that prey populations have become relatively volatile. There is less mud shrimp than there used to be. And this makes us wonder about weight gain as well. So we're studying aspects of sandpiper movement ecology and diet in the bay in an effort to help enhance conservation for these birds. So I'll talk really briefly about diet. We can examine diet using blood samples. I won't go into the details of that, but the result is that what we've learned is that birds are actually very flexible, and not surprisingly, they're able to eat what's available, and that is great news. The other really kind of cool thing that we've learned, as I mentioned earlier, is that biofilm, which you can kind of see a little greenish brown tinge on the surface of the sediment here. This is biofilm. Biofilm is now really important to them. And so that factors into the kind of data we collect and kind of analyses that we do. The thing I'll spend more time on is talking about where the birds go when they're here and how long they stay. So historically, we thought birds stayed around 2 weeks in the Upper Bay. This was based on resighting of color-marked birds that was done back in the 1970s and 80s. Now we have different techniques available to us, so we can track movements of the birds. And to do that, we initiated a collaborative, long-term collaborative study between my lab and my colleague Julie Paquette at the Canadian Wildlife Service. And we've been, for the past 8 or 9 years, we've been working together on trying to understand some of these mysteries of movement of birds in the area. So we do this using radio telemetry. So this little thing right here is a tiny radio transmitter. It weighs about 2/3 of a gram, so it's not a big problem for the birds to carry around. We glue it onto their lower back. And we're using glue because when these birds eventually get to South America and molt, the tag will just fall off. And that's great because we don't want them to be carrying it long term, and the battery's going to die anyway. So this is a good way to get the data we need, but not saddle the bird with it forever. So to do this, we have to catch the birds. So we use this at Johnson's Mills. We use this special net called the Fundy pull trap, and you can see it all furled up here. All of this is birds roosting around the net. We pull the net, catch birds, bring them back into the banding cabin and do a bunch of things with them. So we weigh them, and that is a toilet paper roll. We measure them. We put these little field readable leg flags on them, and this means that we can identify the birds at a distance and maybe even see them in subsequent years when they come back. And also, of course, we put those little tags that I showed you on there. So we've been tagging birds, as I said, for the past 8 years. We have a number of locations in Atlantic Canada. I'm going to focus today just on this region of the Upper Bay of Fundy. Once we put the tags on the birds, we're able to track their movements using the Modus Wildlife Tracking System. This is a network of receivers that is essentially expanding dramatically, but had its initiation in Atlantic Canada. And each of these little points shows where a receiver is, and the little ellipses around the receivers show antenna orientations and how far they can detect a bird. So if a bird flies past one of these things through the beam, it gets logged on the receiver, which gets transmitted to Modus, and then eventually finds its way to us. So we can get details about movement and how long they're staying, in ways that we never could previously. So the results, as I said, we've done a lot of years of this, but I want to highlight one specific study that we did. My former master's student, Sarah Naima, did this. In this, we were tagging birds in 3 different areas. So up in Shepparton Bay and a little bit in Cumberland Basin right here, in Minas Basin down here, and in Cobequid Bay, which is near Truro. And after tagging the birds, we looked at their movements, and the colors represent birds tagged in different places. And what you can see from this figure is that they really, really don't move among regions of the bay. They move around a lot within regions, but not among. There's a couple of moves in 2014, but not much. And in fact, we found that 95% of birds remained in the region of the bay in which they were tagged. So this has really important conservation implications in terms of making sure that different areas of habitat are protected. We can take that a step further by looking at these same birds in the years subsequent to when they were initially caught and tagged. And so we're using these little leg flags again, reciting them. So between 2013 and 2016, we managed to recite over 500 of the initial birds that we had tagged, and we found that 97% of them returned to the same region of the bay where they had been banded. So this tells us that not only are the birds using just a single region within a year, but they're coming back to the same region in multiple years. So again, conserving all areas of the bay is important. The other thing I want to mention briefly is that they tend to stay a little bit longer now than they used to. We used to think the stopover was around 2 weeks. Our tracking data today suggests it's closer to 3 weeks. Obviously, our methods differ dramatically. This is a color marked bird from the 1970s. This is our radio tag bird. So the comparison is not perfect, but we do have good evidence that there has been some change. So that's a focus of what we're interested in now. What might be driving this change? We know the diets have shifted somewhat. We know disturbance from peregrines and other things is a potential issue. Maybe there's something else going on. So that's something we're looking at going forward. So my take-home message here is that mudflats are changing, shorebirds have adapted, that's good news, but the future is certainly still up in the air. Climate change is an obvious threat that we're going to have to focus on so many levels. For shorebirds, we have a sense that migration timing may be affected by climate change. The warming Arctic may cause them to come later. Sea level rise, of course, is going to result in less space to roost and slower weight gain. The food base is changing. We need to think about that with respect to weight gain. Later departures may be affected by storms. There are many things to consider. And of course, the population declines are alarming. The good news is that stopover in this region does not appear to be the issue, but we want to make sure that it stays that way. So, as I mentioned, it's important that we conserve all of these essential sites like Johnson's Mills. Just as an example of how some of the work that we've done has been applied to conservation, I want to mention briefly the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. This is an organization that designates areas in the Western Hemisphere as important to shorebirds. And back in the late 1980s, the parts of the Upper Bay of Fundy were designated as a site of hemispheric importance. That is the highest designation this organization does. However, NCC staff and Canadian Wildlife Service, using our collective work, proposed expanding that designation to include more parts of the bay. So initially we had Shepparton Bay here and we had the Minas Basin down here. We proposed expanding to Cumberland Basin and Cobequid Bay, and that was accepted in 2019. And so the region has now achieved a landscape designation, which is, providing additional awareness and protection for the birds. So with that, I think I'll stop. There's a ton of people to acknowledge in a study like this. It's a big collaborative effort, and I hope that it illustrates the value of doing collaborations like this. So thanks for listening, and I think a little bit later I might be able to address some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Hamilton. We really appreciate you being here today and sharing your expertise and your insights, and for your dedication to this long-term research, which is really critical to being able to understand how to protect and conserve shorebirds as they're moving through this part of Canada. Our next speaker today is Jasmine Anderson. Jasmine's a shorebird interpreter and manager this year of our Johnson's Mills Reserve. Jasmine is from Campbellton, New Brunswick, and a recent graduate of Mount Allison University's biology program with a minor in environmental science. We were very happy that Jasmine could join us again this year. This is her second year at the center. Although our interpretive center itself was closed to visitors this year for the first time in 20 years, it was very important for us to have staff on site to protect the birds and to deal with the visitors who would still come and have come this year. And Jasmine is excited to give you a little bit of information about what she's learned working at the Shorebird Center. So I will turn it over to you whenever you're ready, Jasmine.
Thanks, Paula and Diana. So I would like to share my experience over the last 2 summers while working at the Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve. Last year, I was fortunate enough to participate in a banding project with Dr. Hamilton at Johnson's Mills. I was able to help weigh the birds and release them when the data collection was finished. This was an amazing experience because not only was I given the opportunity to hold and weigh a semi-palmated sandpiper for the purposes of research, but I was also able to watch the process of data collection for shorebird research. All long-distance migrating shorebirds have had population declines, and it is now more important than ever to understand their life cycle, what they eat, and where they migrate to. The Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve is important because tens of thousands of shorebirds come to fuel their migration to South America each year by feeding on the mudflats. Last year, the peak number of birds was about 130,000, and this year, the peak at Johnson's Mills was 30,000 birds. When speaking to locals, they agree that this is the lowest number of birds that they have seen while visiting the beach, but the birds have been using other areas within the Bay of Fundy due to low water levels and predator activity. The Nature Conservancy of Canada has protected Johnson's Mills because the mudflats here are so important for the massive flocks of shorebirds to fuel their migration to their wintering grounds, and the need to reduce human disturbance on the beach during high tide. The shorebirds cannot swim, and thus they utilize the beach area during high tide in order to rest and conserve the energy that they've gained while feeding during the entire low tide period. Thus, the energy that the shorebirds gain while feeding in the Bay of Fundy is critical to the 72 hours nonstop flight to South America, which covers an amazing 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers, an amazing feat during the Atlantic hurricane season. I find that people get the most excited when I tell them about this journey. Zoe, Taylor, Catherine, and I had a lot of interesting challenges this year with the COVID-19 restrictions and the break-ins, but our biggest challenge remains educating the public about why they shouldn't be on the beach during high tide in order to protect the birds, and making sure that the public refrains from using the beach for the entire high tide period. Most people are unaware that the birds are protected and that they use the beach to rest, so it's important that we educate our visitors on these facts. As interns at Johnson's Mills, we educate the public on the life of shorebirds, why we should protect them, and how to view them safely. The Nature Conservancy of Canada has built a viewing deck at the Interpretive Centre to give visitors a place to view the shorebirds closely while not disturbing them. As you can see in this picture that was taken last year, I'm on the deck, and you can see a large group of birds right behind me. Often, the shorebirds will come close to the viewing deck to roost, which allows for optimal viewing of them during the high tide period. And often you'll be able to see tens of thousands of birds at once. And I hope you can plan a trip to see it next year. This internship is important to me because it has taught me a lot about conservation, shorebirds, science communication, and it has allowed me to expand my knowledge of plants, which are a personal interest of mine. I now feel comfortable making hard scientific concepts easier to understand for those who may not have a science background. I enjoy being able to describe the life of a semi-palmated sandpiper to visitors because they are always amazed at how the birds are capable of such a long migration, despite their small size and the time of year when they migrate directly over the Atlantic Ocean without rest. The fact that they fly over the Atlantic Ocean during hurricane season makes their migration even more amazing. The semi-palmated sandpiper is a small bird, and we often compare their weight when they arrive to the Bay of Fundy, which is approximately 20 grams, to that of a large strawberry. And when they leave to continue their migration to South America, they weigh about 40 grams or 2 large strawberries. When the birds rest on the beach during high tide, they are so close to one another that there are about 100 birds per square meter. One of my most memorable days of last summer was during the peak of the season when there were 130,000 birds roosting on the beach right in front of the center. It was an amazing sight because the entire beach was covered in birds, and when a peregrine falcon came by to hunt the birds, they all flew in the air, and the sound of all of their wings moving at once was one that I'll never forget. It's almost impossible to describe, but the sound of that many birds beating their wings at once is amazing at how much sound a small bird could generate. I love my job because it allows me to expand my knowledge in my favorite subject, which is the natural world. Specifically, I'm passionate about marine life, birds, and plants. So having a job that allows me to not only expand my knowledge, but to share that knowledge with others who want to learn is very important to me. Prior to my first summer as a shorebird interpreter, my birding skills were not the greatest, and I was unfamiliar with identifying many species of birds. Now I can identify multiple species of shorebirds, some songbirds, and the calls of some birds of prey, such as the bald eagle and the peregrine falcons. My internship has also allowed me to dive into another subject that I was not completely familiar with before, which was invasive plants. Last summer, I was able to prepare protocols to remove an extremely invasive plant, also known as Japanese knotweed, that is found on the property at Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve. This experience has given me the confidence to educate people, whether I'm at work or at home, about the importance of knowing about invasive plants, why they are bad for the environment, and how to go about removing them from a property, although it is best to catch them early on. To conclude my talk, I would like to offer a personal thank you to the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund, the New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund, the Hewitt Foundation, HRDC's Canada Summer Job Program, Eco Canada, the Iowa Nicky Foundation, the Crabtree Foundation, in-kind support from the Environment Climate Change Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service, and donations to the Interpretive Centre for funding the intern program and other expenses at Johnson's Mills this year. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. We're happy you were able to take the time out of your duties at Johnson's Mills today to share your experiences with us, and thank you so much for the work that you and your colleagues have been doing down there all summer in this interesting year. And again, I would reiterate your thanks to all of the donors and supporters of our Interpretive Centre. We certainly couldn't do it without that support. We do have some questions for the speakers that have been submitted by the audience. As a reminder, if you have a question yet that you haven't submitted, you can click on the question and answer box and submit it there. So at this time, I'm just going to go over and see what we have. Okay, so I guess this could be for both of you, but maybe I'll direct it to Dr. Hamilton first. It is one of our attendees has sent in the comment saying that it's very disheartening to hear about the decline in population of these birds, and I feel helpless to try and help. How do you stay positive?
Okay, I'll tackle that. So, well, the birds keep us positive in many ways because they're just so remarkable. Each summer, the females migrate, then the males migrate, then the juveniles migrate all by themselves. So you have 2-month-old babies flying 3,000 kilometers or more on their own. They arrive in the right place, and then go on their way. So just exposure to these birds makes us think, yeah, we need to do something here and stay positive about it. But the other thing is with the population declines, they have stabilized recently. I'd say in the past decade the populations are pretty stable. So the dip happened somewhere in the late 90s or a bit later, and we're still trying to understand that a little bit. But the good news is that it seems to be pretty stable right now. So that's, I guess, a bit of a comment on that.
Great, thanks so much, Debbie, who sent that question all the way from Saskatoon. I think this one would also be for you, Dr. Hamilton. A question from Judy May. How do they actually eat the biofilm?
Okay, so that's a great question. They have a different feeding mode entirely. It's called skimming. And what they do is they put their bill on the surface of the mud and they run it along the surface and basically pick it up. And I don't know, can I share my screen here? I'd like to show, I've got a couple of slides that will allow you to understand why they can pull that off. If nobody minds me sharing my screen really quickly, because I threw these in here because I thought people might, I sort of had a feeling somebody might ask that. So they do this biofilm skimming at night. So we have night vision gear and we go out and watch them at night and see what they're doing. And that's how we actually figured out that they were doing it. But this is how they pull it off. They have hairy tongues, which is really cool. So these are scanning electron microscope images of tongue morphology. So these hairy tongues can pick up the biofilm as they go along the sediment. Anyway, all right, I will stop sharing. So yeah, that's the answer to that one.
That is very cool. Thanks for that great question. I'm going to give this one to Jasmine, who's out there every day or nearly every day looking at the shorebirds and can probably tell us. We know semipalmated sandpipers are the most common. What would be the second and third most common species of shorebird you see at Johnson's Mills?
So the second most common you'd see is the semipalmated plover. In my presentation, that was the second bird that I had shown. And then I would say the third most common that we see this year has been the black-bellied plover. So we've seen about 100 of them each day. But yeah, that's what I would say. It's those two.
Great. Another one for Dr. Hamilton, and this is from Eva. How safe is the glue that you use for the trackers, and what's it made of? Is there any concerns with that product?
It's the same material as Crazy Glue. It's cyanoacrylate, and this is a standard attachment method that is used on a lot of animals and has been used for a long time, and it's not really problematic to them at all. You know, sometimes we get Crazy Glue on our fingers and it's sticky, but it's okay. Yeah, so no, there's no concerns with that. We've seen lots of birds that we've tagged have arrived in South America quite safely and happily, and we actually do some work in South America as well where we tag birds there, and we've seen several of them come back up here happily. So there's no issues there.
Great. And I think one more for you, an anonymous question of how do the birds find their way to the exact same place year after year, if you know the answer to that one?
Not entirely. That is a great question. The navigation in birds is achieved through a whole bunch of different methods, depending upon the species. Some use the sun, some use the stars, some use any number of different approaches. The thing that they're basically evolutionarily, they've been selected to come to an area where the food supply is good and they can stop and feed and succeed. And so there is an evolutionary advantage for birds who can manage this, and hence that ability to get there gets selected for. The fact that they come back to the same arm of the bay year after year was actually a little bit surprising to us. Regional fidelity, site fidelity in shorebirds is well documented on breeding grounds. There's a little bit less knowledge associated with some of the migratory stopover areas on the details associated with it, but this study that we published fairly recently suggests that it's pretty important here. So the exact mechanism, I can't tell you, but I can tell you that the reason they're doing this, they're coming here, is because those who come here do well, and hence they're able to pass that inclination on to their offspring.
Great. And we've got just one more question. We are at our time today, but I'm going to give this one to Jasmine. When would be a good time for people to visit the Upper Bay of Fundy to see this shorebird migration?
So this year was kind of an odd one with the migrations. So the birds were a little late than normal this year, but I would say during mid-August is a good time typically to view them. Yeah.
Great. Well, that is our time. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for the webinar. Dr. Hamilton and Jasmine, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience. If you have any additional comments regarding today's webinar or would like to connect with NCC, you can reach out to us directly by emailing events@natureconservancy.ca. And you can hear about updates on future webinars and events in your area or online by looking at our events page at natureconservancy.ca/events. So stay tuned for the link to today's webinar recording. You should receive that in a follow-up email within the next 24 hours. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day. We hope to see you next time.